Hey everyone, this is Kevin from thechesswebsite.com. Today we're going to be continuing our series on Garry Kasparov versus Deep Blue. We're in game number 6 in the 1996 matchup between the Grandmaster and the IBM supercomputer. If you've been following the series up until this point, Garry Kasparov going into game number 6 is up 3-2, and he's going to be playing the white pieces during this game. So with one game left, all Garry Kasparov really has to do is not lose. If he ties, he'll end up winning 3.5 points to 2.5 points. So as long as he can win or tie, he's going to be crowned the champion. So most players in this situation would play fairly aggressive since they are white, but in the back of their mind think, okay, I can pretty much play for a draw, which is much easier than trying to play for a win. The good thing for the chess world is that Garry Kasparov said, forget this idea. I'm going to go for blood, and I'm going to try to win this thing 4-2, and that's exactly what he does. So we're going to go ahead and get into it. It's a fantastic game, a great way to wrap up the 1996 series between Garry Kasparov and Deep Blue. Again, white's going to be played by Garry Kasparov, and black's going to be played by the IBM supercomputer Deep Blue. White starts with knight to f3, simple development move. This is the ready open and really gives white a lot of flexibility into how he wants to transition later into a specific opening. Black's going to respawn with pawn to d5, white plays pawn to d4, and black's going to play pawn to c6, getting into one of these Slav defenses. White's now going to play pawn to c4. This is the queen's gambit line. Black has the option of either taking here on c4, taking the gambit, or he can decline it. Now black does decide to decline it with pawn to e6, and this is the semi-Slav line. Now a lot of people, when they're watching these videos, they actually want to go watch the defense on the semi-Slav to kind of figure out what that's about. So feel free to do that if you want to, but this is the semi-Slav line. The difference is Slav line, typically you'll bring out the light square bishop before you kind of solidify that pawn chain, but the semi-Slav says, okay, I'm going to bring my pawn here to e6. Now it's very, very important. As you can tell, this light square bishop is blocked in. Black really has to have a lot of counterplay later on, or he's really going to be squeezed. As you can see, he's building a pretty solid defense, but his pieces aren't very active. He's really starting to block some of his pieces in. So if he doesn't really have a strong counterattack, he's pretty much going to be squeezed. He's not going to have a lot of room to move with all of his pieces. That definitely holds true. Anytime you see the semi-Slav, it's also going to hold true in this game as well. So just keep that in mind. In the back of your head as you're kind of watching this video, as far as Garry Kasparov knows that he's now playing the semi-Slav, so he now has a very specific way he's going to be playing against black. Now white's going to play knight to d2. A lot of times you will just see knight to c3. This is a okay move if you see this and you're playing this as well. Knight to c3 is definitely okay. A lot of times these grandmasters will do a lot of studying on different variations and lines that they think are sometimes just as good, but people haven't really studied a lot, so sometimes they'll try them out here and there. But make no mistake about it, he's definitely done his research and he knows that knight to d2 here is a very playable move. Now, keep in mind that Garry Kasparov is blocking off this bishop here on c1. Typically, if you're going to play this, you're going to be bringing your bishop somewhere else since he has blocked it off from coming along this long diagonal here. So look for Garry Kasparov to be bringing his bishop to either b2 or a3, kind of these long diagonals here. Black's now going to respond with knight to f6. Simple development move, trying to control the center of the board. Needs to definitely get some of those minor pieces involved into the game. White's going to play pawn to e3, solidifying his pawn chain, also getting ready to bring his light square bishop involved into the game so he can go ahead and castle on the king side. Now black's going to play pawn to c5, trying to get some of that counterattack in this game. Wants to make sure that all his pieces are not just in the back with no room to breathe at all. So white's now going to play pawn to b3. Really, both sides aren't capturing anything. They're just really trying to solidify the center of the board, really trying to just develop all their pieces and then attack later on. So as we've already talked about, this bishop now can come to b2 if he wants to. He can come to a3 depending on where black moves. But this move right here needed to come anyway because, again, this dark square bishop needed to get out here. So this is a natural move for Garry Kasparov to bring his pawn to b3. So definitely okay with that. Now the knight's going to come to c6. Again, simple development move, controlling the center of the board right here. If this pawn on c5 doesn't come here, a lot of times you'll see the knight come to d7 and then try to start a counterattack on either side. But in this case, since the pawn has already come to c5, then the knight's going to go ahead and come right behind it on c6, really starting to put a lot of pressure on this pawn on d4. Now white's going to respond with bishop to b2, again solidifying. Again, early game, you always want to have your pawns controlling the center of the board, and your minor pieces are going to be supporting those pawns at the center of the board. Now, later on into the game, you're going to have your minor pieces doing a lot of the attacking, with your major pieces, your rooks and your queens, supporting those pieces. And then late game, if you have those major pieces, they're really going to be doing a lot of the action. But that's kind of what you're seeing here, the pawns controlling the center of the board and the minor pieces simply supporting those in the center of the board. From here, black's going to take on d4, and white's going to recapture with his pawn on d4. Again, there's no reason for white to capture with his minor pieces. Early on into the game, they really want to be supporting those pawns which are controlling the center of the board. So from here, black's going to play bishop to e7. Definitely wants to make sure that he gets his dark squared bishop out so he can castle on the king side. And white's going to bring his rook over to c1. Now, again, it's going to be fine if white brings his bishop over to, let's say, d3. He's going to need to eventually get his light square bishop involved into the game. So either way is fine. White just wants to go ahead and get ready for, in case this is recaptured, that he has this on a semi-open file. Now black's going to castle on the king side, and then white's going to play bishop to d3. Again, getting ready to castle on the king side. Now black's going to play bishop to d7. Again, he still has it kind of blocked here from e6, so he can't get it too far, but definitely wants to make sure that he has all of his minor pieces developed somewhat, so he can start again to counterattack. White's now going to castle on the king side, and then black's going to play knight to h5. He really wants to play knight to f4 and then take this bishop on d3. White's pieces are much more active than black. And as you'll see kind of later on to the game, white really has a strong attack. He's trying to open up the game and point both of his bishops against the black king right here. Dual bishops, especially when you get the game open, are very, very powerful together. So black now knows that he needs to actually start taking some initiative and start to trade off for some of these pieces that later on could cause a huge pain point for black. White's now going to respond with rook to e1. Again, you always want to put your rooks on semi-open files. Right here, this is a great spot. This rook now can roam on the first rank, and it can also roam on this e file right here. So great spot for this rook. Black's going to respond with his knight coming to f4, is kind of what we talked about. And then white's just going to kick his bishop back to b1. Still trying to control this long diagonal here. Definitely wants to make sure he does not trade that off. Really just doesn't do anything for him. He has the more active pieces. He has the kind of better setup right now. So right now he wants to make sure that he has all of those aggressive pieces on the board. Doesn't want to trade those off. From here, the bishop's going to come to d6. Now, I think really in this case, you could easily bring the rook over to c8 if you're kind of looking at this and trying to figure out why do people play what they do and where should I be looking. Simple things to think about. Bringing this rook over to c8. This is a semi-open file. White has a semi-open file here on the e file. So bringing the rook over to c8, very, very powerful move. Instead, black decides to go ahead and centralize his bishop a little bit more with bishop to d6. And then white's going to play pawn to g3. Since this bishop has come back, he now decides, okay, this knight's kind of getting in my way, so I'm going to go ahead and kick him back. So the knight's now going to come back to g6, and white's going to play knight to e5. This knight really isn't doing as much as he needs as far as his attack. Again, he's really looking to expand on the queen side and then really open up the king side here for his bishops to really get involved into the game. So he's going to go ahead and try to sacrifice one of his knights, try to open up the game, take away some of the pieces, but leave a lot of space for his pieces to kind of roam around the game. Black responds with rook to c8, kind of as what we talked about before. I think he should have done it first, I guess, if he is the computer. But again, I think the supercomputer probably could have done that first. From here, the knight's going to take here on d7, exchanging the knight for the bishop. Again, that's exactly what Garry Kasparov wants to do. He wants to have the dual bishop pair and wants to take the bishops off the board for his opponent. Now the queen's going to recapture here on d7, so black has now finished his development. He has all of his pieces involved into the game, and he also has connected his rooks. White's now going to play knight to f3, again opening the board up a little bit more. He now has a little bit more room for his queen to roam around, and now black's going to play bishop to b4. Coming down to attack, it's really not going to do too much. The rook's just going to come up here to e3, and then black's going to play rook over to d8. Again, this rook move, it's kind of a waiting move. There's not a lot of space for black to go right now, so he's kind of just waiting right now, more than likely trying to just find some mistake from white. Really there's no easy way. There's not even a hard way right now for black to win this game, so unfortunately for him, the best he could probably do is tie. But Garry Kasparov has other plans. From here, white's going to play pawn to h4. Again, he's going to eventually attack on the queen side, but he wants to start to put pressure on the king side. And he realizes that with this setup, that black, he's pretty much just choking himself, and he really doesn't have a lot of room. There's really no good way for him to come over to the king side and actually counterattack, so he's going to start pushing forward. He already has all of his pieces lined up against this, black king over here. So he says, I'm going to go ahead and start pushing my pawns up your face as well. Black is now going to bring his knight back to e7. Again, being pretty passive with his pieces. And now white really starts to push his pieces forward. And not only does he push his pieces forward, but as you'll see, he starts to kick back the bishop. And he's going to push forward with his pawn here. Again, moving these back, moving his pawns forward and moving them with tempo. He's now going to bring his pawn up to c5, but he's choking black more and more. Black's getting fewer and fewer squares that he can move his pieces to, and he's also opening the board up for his pieces. Again, his bishops are just getting more and more room to move around. His queen is going to become a lot more active. And as you can see, black is just kind of all in this 3x3 square right here. The queen really can't move anywhere. The rooks back here are completely blocked off. And so black's just kind of in this waiting game where white has complete control over the board, which a lot of times is what you see when you play the semi-Slav if you don't have a very, very strong counterattack. From here, black's going to bring his rook over to e8. Again, kind of a waiting move. No real initiative that he can do. Just kind of waiting for white. So white plays queen to d3, centralizing a little bit more, putting a lot of pressure, obviously threatening to take here on h7. Supercomputer's now going to play pawn to g6. Definitely wants to make sure that he stops this. And now the rook's going to come back to e2, and the knight's going to come over here to f5. Garry Kasparov wants to make sure that he's being very active. He's not responding to anything, so he wants to go ahead and bring this rook back to e2 even before this knight comes to f5, and then has to respond to that. So Garry Kasparov just says, I'm going to be in complete control. I'm not even going to move in response to you. I'm going to do it before you even get there. So white's now going to bring his bishop to c3, and black's going to play pawn to h5. Trying to counterattack on the king side. Wants to make sure that white doesn't push up any further. So really trying to give himself a little bit more room to breathe, but a little bit too late in this situation. White's going to continue to push forward on the queen side. It plays pawn to b5. The knight's going to come back to e7. It's a pretty passive move. Knight to a5 is a lot more aggressive. Obviously, a knight on the rim is dim. But in this case, bringing the knight back to e7 is not doing a whole lot. At least in this case, he can always bring it to c4. He does have this nice little outpost formed from this pawn on d5. So he does have a lot of options here. If the bishop takes, then black can respond and take with his bishop here, trading off one of these dark square bishops that Garry Kasparov really wants to hold on to. So, a5 would have, potentially given him some counterplay right here, but instead he decides to play a little bit more passive and let Garry Kasparov continue to push forward and just completely smother him with his pieces and just really give black nowhere to move. So Again, knight to e7 here, and then the bishop comes over to d2. Black's going to respond with king to g7, trying to get a little bit of room again to breathe. And the pawn's now going to come to a4. He's just going to start to push forward with his pawns. Really not going to be a whole lot that he can do. Now from here, Black has different options. I think the option he chose is probably wrong. He chose rook over to a8. Probably would have been a little bit more aggressive if he played, pawn to a6, trying to get some counterplay here. If he can kind of open this board up, trade off some of these pawns, he can start to swing his rooks over here and try to get some counterplay on the queen side. But instead, he just kind of moves his rook along the 8th rank, which doesn't do a whole lot of good. And Garry Kasparov just continues to push forward. He plays pawn to a5. And now it's a little bit too late. The pawn's now going to come to a6. And now this pawn's just going to push forward to b6. Again, this is just strangling. This bishop right here on c7 really doesn't have anywhere to go, so he comes back to b8. And now this rook here on a8 is kind of trapped. So as we talked about before, probably wasn't the best move to bring the rook over to a8. And now we look at it and it's just kind of trapped. This dark square bishop's going to have a hard time actually coming out into the game. He can't come to c7. D6, e5, or f4 is going to be captured. So it's going to be a hard time for Black to get any sort of counterplay with this rook on a8. A lot of times, if you've seen any of the other games that I've analyzed, you'll say, such and such player gave up material, and then they pretty much had more active pieces than their opponent, and it's all about the amount of pieces you have in the fight. It's not how many pieces you have, it's about how many pieces you have in the fight. In this case, Garry Kasparov has the same amount of pieces on the board. He also has way more guys in the fight. Again, Black is really not doing a lot, just kind of waiting for Garry Kasparov to run over him. So Garry Kasparov obliges with that request. White's now going to come, bring his bishop to c2, just kind of setting everything up. He can pretty much take his time. He knows that Black really doesn't have a lot of counterplay. So he can slowly and methodically set up his pieces exactly how he wants to. Now the knight's going to come back to c6, and then the bishop's going to come over here to a4, pinning this knight down on c6 to the queen right here on d7. The rook's going to come over here to e7, and the bishop's now going to come to c3. Now Black does have some counterplay, and he actually plays knight to e5. Again, this is opening up the door for the bishop to take on d7, but it's also allowing him to capture this queen here on d3. Now it's actually going to be a mistake if White captures here on d7. The knight will come down here to d3 and take. If it would be a terrible move if, let's say White decided to, move his bishop out of the way, then he would lose his rook here on c1. If he decided to, bring his pawn up to, let's say, c6 to hold on to this bishop, then he's going to lose his rook here on c1. If he instead decides, bring his rook over to d1, he again is going to lose his bishop here on d7. He's really not going to have as many active pieces as he'd really like to. So this is not the option that he chooses. Instead, he decides to go ahead and just take with his pawn right here on e5. And then after the bishop takes, he's now going to bring his knight over here to d4, and then they're going to exchange their knights, and the queen's going to come to d4. So much better position for White right now. Black no longer has any pieces that he has any sort of counterplay, so he decides to go ahead and bring his queen back to d7. White responds with bishop to d2. Black responds bringing his rook back to e8. And now the bishop comes over here to g5. Great square. It's an outpost from this pawn here on h5. It's going to be really hard for him to kick this off again. This bishop here on b8 is not going anywhere. And really, this pawn really can't come forward because the pawn here on e5, which White recently put there, is kind of blocking this. So this is going to be a great square, really limiting, the few pieces or squares that Black has. Pretty much limiting all those right here. So Black's going to bring his rook over to c8. pretty much just moving all his pieces to one side of the board, not really doing a whole lot, trying to get some sort of counterplay on this semi-open file on the C file, but just too little too late. The bishop's now going to come to f6, a little more central square for this bishop. Again, he had an outpost here on g5. He also has an outpost here on f6. The king's going to come over here to h7, and now the pawn's going to push forward. Now black has two options. He can either take it, with his pawn. He can also take it with his rook. He's not really going to take it with his queen because then he'll lose that. But if he takes it with his rook, then white can swing over here after the exchange. White's going to be doing much better. It's going to be really hard for black to do anything. So it really doesn't matter what black does. He doesn't have a whole lot of great options. He decides to go ahead and take. The reason white gives up this material is that he knows that later on he can push forward with his pawn to b7, and that's definitely going to be winning. So after black takes right here on c6, then white brings his queen to c5, kind of solidifying this, making sure that this pawn doesn't push forward anymore. Again, he wants to take away all the squares that black can move and completely choke him to death. Now the black king's going to come over here to h6. White's not really worried about that. He's going to swing his rook over here to b2. Again, he wants to push forward with his pawn to b7. He's going to be capturing one of these rooks on a8 or c8, so just too much for black to deal with. He brings his queen over to b7, and now the rook comes here to b4. If he wants to, he can always swing his rook over here to b1. Just too much for black to handle, and he from here just decides to resign. The next move from white, if it continued, he could always bring his queen to e7, and after the queens trade off again, then this pawn could come to b7. It's just going to be too hard for him to handle, especially if the other rook comes over here to b1. White's going to be able to promote his pawn, or he's going to be able to take one of these pieces. Black's just really not going to have any response. So again, fantastic win for Garry Kasparov, 1996. Ends up winning and defeating Deep Blue, the IBM supercomputer, 4-2. Pretty much, stakes claim that at this time, obviously things have changed, but at this time in 1996, humans are still better at chess than computers. So hopefully you guys enjoyed this video. We'll be starting a new series shortly on the 1997 rematch between Garry Kasparov and Deep Blue. But hope you guys enjoyed it, and I'll see you guys in the next video. Thanks for watching.